country at this point, which is expanded voting rights to include people who don't own property, right? So from an economic standpoint, from a class standpoint, it could be argued that it's more egalitarian and more equal, but it really only applies to white people, specifically white men at the time, right, who can vote and nobody else can. So that's what the abolition. So the abolition movement is the focus, but there are other areas in this age of reforming individuals through what's called the temperance movement, making alcohol illegal. This concern about the consumption of alcohol in America, but the idea that affects the entire country too, right? Public education, ensuring that everyone has access to education, ending slavery, right? Which is really a national. For some abolitionists and for some people, obviously there are people who are enslaved, and that's wrong, and they don't deserve to be slaves individually. But for a lot of folks, there's still. I mean, even though there are white abolitionists, and even though they're opposed to slavery, they're still in the 19th. They're still living in this time period. They're a product of the time. So a lot of them didn't necessarily see it as viewing slaves as being equal to them, but they viewed it as, they viewed it as a national issue, a national problem. Slavery needs to be reformed so that the nation can improve, right? The Constitution says we the people in order to form a more perfect union. The idea of perfectionism. The Second Great Awakening was a religious revival movement, an evangelical movement. It replaces, for a lot of folks, the idea of predestination. Is anyone familiar with like original sin? If you're a sinner, if you grow up to be someone who commits crimes, or you're guilty of some sin, it's because that's the path that you're on this earth to be an example for the rest of us, or you're just a sinner. God, and that's the way God made you, or something like that. There's nothing you can do over it. It's called predestination. Perfectionism, the idea that through your own actions, through your own reform, you can become more perfect, right? You can become a better person. So, and the Whig Party, there's two political parties at this point, the Democrats and the Whigs. They're like, the primary motivation, if you look behind the Whig Party, is the idea that we can use government to put things in place to improve the nation, to improve people's lives, and thereby, in so doing, we improve the nation. So ending slavery. There are Whigs who are slave owners in the South, but generally, if you're an abolitionist, you tended to vote for the Whigs. If we make temperance, the temperance from alcohol, right, to temper your alcohol consumption, to make it illegal. If we remove that temptation from people, this idea that alcohol it creates a problem in homes of Americans, right? It results in domestic violence. It results in financial. Public education, universal public education. This idea of, because there was no public school back then, especially if you lived on the frontier. Abraham Lincoln, who grew up in Indiana, Kentucky, he was born in Kentucky, grew up in Indiana, Illinois, which was considered the frontier back then, or the West. He estimated that he probably had one school year of education total. Because if you're going to have voting rights expand, at least at this point for white males, but then eventually for former slaves within a few generations of this, and women with the 19th Amendment, if you're going to have people voting as much as they are, and you're going to have a democracy, it's a good idea that you have a foundation put in place where they can become informed citizens, right? They get some sort of education, so they are prepared to make their own decisions intelligently, right? Voting and stuff. So, the author says on page 439, every northern state has established tax-supported school systems, right? There was not, the expansion of public education is not occurring on the same level in the South, which is partially, arguably primarily out of a fear of an educated or literate slave population, right? 95% of slaves are illiterate. But this also, the fact that public education does not expand as much in the South means that the illiteracy rate among white Southerners, like poor white Southerners, is very high, right? They're being left out of a lot of these things. The women's movement, early feminism is going to come out of this abolition movement, and that deals with important stuff too, because the women have very few rights. Like within a marriage, they don't have the right to vote, and there are immigration issues where immigrants are sometimes not being treated very well. But the fact that there's millions of people who are slaves, I think is arguably the primary thing that needs to be addressed as far as reform, especially when you're a democracy and you're based on the idea that we're all created equal. That the fact that there are going to be 4 million slaves is going to be something that needs to be addressed. Jefferson owned slaves. But the ideas that were put out in the Declaration that we are all equal really allows for an abolition movement to start. Because it turns slavery into something that was sort of normal to something that's into a peculiar institution. It's strange now. White abolitionists, mostly in the North. There are some Southerners, there are examples of Southerners who own slaves, who become abolitionists and free their slaves, and then a lot of them had to leave Southern states and move north because their lives were threatened. I mean, you have abolitionists, a lot of them run newspapers, like William Lloyd Garrison, who ran The Liberator, who was a newspaper, who was almost, I mean, this is a guy who was almost lynched, who supported the idea of emancipating the slaves, ending slavery, but then recolonizing them in Africa. Like having them return, in their eyes, having them return to their homeland, even though at this point, most of these slaves are born in the United States and don't know any other place to call. Even though they're slaves, and even though the level of treatment is horrendous, they still are from here, they're born here, they live here, they don't identify as, with anything in Africa. And the fact that also there's the circumstances that they immigrated here, right? They were captured, they were put on a boat as cargo. Their language, their cultural, their religion, in a lot of instances, even their names were taken away from them. They were given new names, practicing a new religion with a new language. And there's no real, the record of migration is not the same as it is for a lot of other groups, where you can go to like the Ellis Island website. Like I can go to the Ellis Island website and look up my ancestors who came here from Sicily, and there's a record of their names are there. They weren't taking the names of slaves that they got on a boat, right? They were packing them into the ship, and so this idea they don't really, by a certain point you don't really identify with Africa anymore because you're not from. And so there's this American American Colonization Society, and it is established, and they established Liberia as the place in Africa where this recolonization. If there are people who are slaves who are freed, even before the Civil War, who want to return to the continent, in quotations, they're not from there, but who want to, go to Africa, go to live in Liberia, they can. And people do, not a lot, but people do. Liberia is still a country. And Sierra Leone and Liberia are next to each other. Sierra Leone was established by the British, and a lot of folks loyalists, slaves who fought with the British during the Revolution are there. But Liberia is established by the United States by this group as a colony for former slaves. And it's established during the presidency of James Monroe. That's why the capital of Liberia is Monrovia. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Who's heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin? It was a series of it was basically a book. It was published in a lot of these newspapers as a series of stories. And eventually it is published as a book. It's published in newspapers in 1851. 3 million millions and millions of copies of this were sold. And then you also have it printed sections of it printed in newspapers. By 1860, there's I think 23 million people in the North, and 3 million copies of this book are floating around the North. I mean, that means a lot of people are going to have read it, or at least read parts of it, right? And are going to be and it's a very negative depiction of the slave society that exists in the South, right? It's a negative depiction of slave owners. It was basically banned in the South. You have an estimated 1,000 slaves annually that are fleeing to the North, right? They run away. One of them is Harriet Tubman, right? Who's part of the Underground Railroad. Another one is Frederick Douglass with 2 S's, right? Both of them were from Maryland, which is the upper South, right? Virginia and Maryland share borders with northern states, so it's much more realistic for a slave to escape, leave a plantation and escape and cross one state line and get to a free state, as opposed to people who are in Texas or Louisiana, where it's like we're talking like 1,000 miles. Frederick Douglass, I mean, we just had the national holiday for Martin Luther King Jr., right? Frederick Douglass is really the first, in many ways, like national figure for civil rights, like an African American leader, like a leader in the so-called like African American community, or for Black Americans, or this, and really this idea of expanding the idea of who is an American and who is a citizen to include everybody. Black abolitionists developed an understanding of freedom that went well beyond the usage of most of their white counterparts. They worked to attack the intellectual foundations of racism, seeking to disprove pseudoscientific arguments for black inferiority. They challenged the prevailing image of Africa as a continent without civilization. so a lot of abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison or white abolitionists, wanted to end slavery because it made America seem hypocritical, or it was something that we're guilty of having this system of labor, right? They didn't necessarily reevaluate how they thought about black people generally. Like, they could still think people still thought they were inferior. There are abolitionists who were racist, whereas with someone like Frederick Douglass, who was a slave, and also becomes a very educated, he's very intelligent, is a public speaker, and just the fact that he exists, he will stand up in front of a crowd and he will address them and speak in a very eloquent and intelligent way. I mean, just that very fact would change a lot of people's hearts and minds. Slavery shouldn't just end because it makes white Americans sinners, but because black people are equal, right? They are. I mean, everyone is equal. And if you look at the recolonization movement, that really is an example of, okay, we want to end slavery, but then we want these people to leave. Like, right? That's kind of, and even if it's for their own, because they'll never accept them here, or it's where you're originally from. Even if there's good intentions, right? There were people who supported Japanese internment who thought it was with good intentions. Oh well, because they'll be singled out because of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, and it might be unsafe for them. People will attack their homes. So let's put them in relocation camps, right? Like, in their mind, they're thinking, some people probably justified it thinking, oh yeah, it's really for their own safety, but they're not the ones that are actually being sent to the camps, right? So that, when it comes to abolition, people who are actually slaves, when it comes to this conversation about abolishing slavery, people who are actually slaves are gonna bring a lot to the table, other than, it's not an abstract thing, it's a real tangible thing. An interesting, the women's movement, early feminism, really comes from the abolition movement, and this is similar to something in the 1960s. And in that the civil rights movement, the issue of the women's movement that launches in the mid to late 1960s, the civil rights movement specifically, there are college kids white college kids who go to Mississippi in 1964 to register black people to vote. It's called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. While male members of this movement to register people to vote are the ones giving interviews to the TV, they're the ones giving all the speeches, they're the ones leading the marches and getting all the attention. They're basically expected to stuff envelopes and address them and make coffee and do all this other stuff. And so the women in this organization, basically a position paper, they issue a mission statement, basically arguing against this and comparing their treatment as women to the treatment of African Americans in the South. It's unequal. It's not fair. It's a violation of our rights, right? That they start to in advocating for this one group over here for their civil rights, they identify their own lack, that they lack civil rights also. So similarly, in the abolition movement, women who are abolitionists, pretty much all women who are part of the early feminist movement in America come from the abolition movement. Because if you think about all the time they're dedicating to looking at this unequal situation, where there's this women's movement that stems out of the abolition movement, sort of culminates in the Seneca Falls Conference. It's in New York, Seneca Falls. It's a conference for women's rights, and it's in 1848 to 1920, because in 1920 that's when there's a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. Right, and that was the primary demand of women at this conference, was the right to vote.